So do you see this? Perfect.
Yep.
Okay, so hi everybody. I will present some completely different work which is related to improving the efficiency of the Bitcoin protocol. And I said the title is Leveraging Weight Functions for Optimistic Responsiveness in Blockchains. And this is joint work with both Simon, Bernardo, Christian, Jesper, and Daniel. All right. So to bring everybody on the same page and actually motivate our work, I thought I would sort of start out showing how an execution of the Bitcoin protocol might look. So in this example, I have abstracted the hashing of blocks to get some below some thresholds as this lottery that you see on the right. So this lottery functions by the participants buying tickets for it. And if they win the right to append a block to this block tree. Let me also introduce you Alice and Bob, who will both be participants of this example of a Bitcoin, how the Bitcoin protocol might play out. Okay, so Alice and Bob starts with only the Genesis block in the block tree. And what they'll do is when the protocol starts, they'll start buying tickets for this lottery. It might be that Bob buys a few more tickets than Alice, but the protocol has no problem handling that. So if Bob gets lucky and actually wins the lottery as he does now, well, then he will check what is his current best chain and actually append a new block to his best chain. In this case, well, there's only one chain in the block tree, namely just the Genesis block. So Bob will extend the Genesis block with a new block, and he will propagate this block to Alice. She can check that Bob, in fact, was the winner of the lottery, and thereby she will also append this block to her block tree. So as they both buy more tickets, it might be that they at some point gets lucky at the same time and actually win the lottery at sort of more or less the same time before either of them have time enough to propagate their new block to the other party. This creates sort of a small fork in the block tree. Such a fork will first be resolved in the Bitcoin protocol when the next when there's a new block mined. So for example, when a block from some other party appears in either place, and this will now determine what is the longest chain of the block tree. Okay, so let this just be a rough sketch of how such a protocol might play out. And let us now try to get some intuition for why this protocol actually works and provides a consensus. Okay, so what I've done here is to sort of plot the events that led to the creation of this block tree on a timeline. So what happened at first was that Bob won, then Alice won, then Bob won again closely afterwards, and finally some unknown party won and a random block occurred. So there are two things to observe here, and that is that if there's enough time between two blocks such that the blocks have actually have time to propagate, meaning that there's more time between two winning events than is upper bound on the network delay, which I call delta net, well, then something good happens in the sense that then we can actually make progress in the protocol. The best chain becomes better. This is nice for the protocol. On the other hand, if these blocks do not have time to propagate, such as what happens between the winning event T2 and T3, well, then there will be a small fork which results in at least one of the honest block being lost, which is a bad thing for the protocol. So this means that in order to ensure security of the Bitcoin protocol, it's obviously very important to configure the lottery properly. And this is what I call the lottery dilemma. Because what you need to do is to essentially guess what an upper bound on the network delay might be before you deploy the protocol in order to instantiate this lottery correctly, such that it has to an appropriate amount of time between each block is produced. And what happens is that if your guess is too low, well, tough luck, then your protocol will not be secure. So you better be a bit conservative, and you will probably set it a bit too high. But the problem is that if your guess is too high, then your protocol will be slow by construction. Okay, so this work takes a step at trying to avoid the need to take this decision. And in this talk, I will present our idea, which is to do a weighted lottery. I will argue the security of this construction. And finally, I'll show that there are actually interesting properties to be achieved by using such a weighted lottery. So let me jump right into it and actually try to define what a weighted lottery is. So in order to explain this, I thought I would sort of first give a few details to the Bitcoin lottery and how it actually works. So in Bitcoin, you participate in the lottery by taking the hash of a block. And if this hash is larger than some value, then it's a valid block, and otherwise, and honest parties will actually accept it. And note that for the purposes of this Bitcoin function fitting within our framework, I've sort of just flipped the inequality here, but this does obviously not matter for security. This is just a matter of instantiating this threshold that the Bitcoin lottery needs in a slightly different way. Okay. Yeah, and one thing to note is that, as we just saw in this example run of the protocol, well, the longest chain is also what is considered to be the best chain. So this changes with the weight lottery. Here we say that every block is a valid block. And now we define an arbitrary weight function, which takes a hash of a block and returns some value, which we'll say is the weight of a block. Now we will use this weight of each block to calculate the total sum of the weight of a chain. And we will say that this is now the chain that is the best chain. This is the chain that honest parties should actually prefer. And just a small note here is if you actually want to deploy this and run it, then you can obviously not say that every block is a valid block, as there will probably be 1 trillion blocks produced every second. So in practice, you want to set a small cutoff, but this is irrelevant for the security of the protocol, which is what I want to talk about today. Okay, so to bring people on the same page again, let's just quickly see how Bitcoin can be seen as an instance of this weight lottery. And it can do so by defining a weight function where if a block was invalid before, then it will get a weight of 0, and otherwise it will have a weight of 1. And then this heaviest chain, well, that will be calculated, correspond to the same, including the same blocks as what was before the longest chain. Okay, so I thought it was also give you a small example of how this might play out with our two participants of such a protocol, namely Alice and Bob. So again, they start out buying a ticket, but this time, however, they immediately win the lottery as all blocks are valid. Okay, so they both get the right to actually extend the block tree. Now, I've sort of tried to scale this lottery such that the size of these blocks are proportional to the weight that these blocks achieve in the lottery. So these are sort of fairly small blocks which have a weight of 0.5. Okay, it might happen that Alice and Bob have time to synchronize before they decide to buy new tickets, but when they actually decide to buy new tickets, well, chances are that yet another fork is created. But in this case, Alice got quite a bit more lucky and actually won a fairly heavy block, as long as Bob won a sort of a small block. And in the meantime, while this is going on, we should remember that all other parties, they will also be producing blocks every time they actually win a lottery. So there'll be quite a few more blocks arriving at both places. There might even be, in the process of synchronizing, and yet another few blocks arrives by blocks produced by unknown persons. Okay, so to make this a fair example between Alice and Bob, I thought I would also let Bob win a heavy block before actually going on. Okay, so let us now again try to be a bit more detailed about what happened and have a look at how these winning events actually led to the creation of this block tree. Let's again have a look at the timeline, where, well, first Alice won a small block, then Bob won a small block, Alice won a huge block, Bob won a small block, then a couple of unknown blocks arrived, and finally Bob was also lucky enough to produce a large block. So a nice observation is here that for this protocol to actually produce a chain that is significantly longer than any other chain, it is enough that there's sufficient time between all of the winning events that corresponds to a heavy block. I mean, in this case, it will be these three blocks that has sort of the majority of the weight. And if there's sufficient enough time here, well, then we will actually create a significantly longer chain. So let me try to argue this a bit more. So let's say we're just given 3 blocks that has sufficient, 3 heavy blocks with sufficient amount of time in between them. So a thing to observe is that if there is sufficient amount of time in between the creation of such heavy blocks, well, then none of them will have the same position in the block tree. And this means that each time such a new heavy block is produced with sufficient amount of time on either side, well, then there will also be a new chain present to all of the honest parties, which is valid and which is longer than all of the previous sufficiently long blocks, sort of sufficient heavy blocks with sufficient amount of time in between them. Okay, so this actually gives us that sort of the amount of weight produced with sufficient time in between that is heavy. Well, we will have a lower bound on the chain growth, which is proportional to this. Okay, but what we really care about when we are talking about blockchains is safety, right? That there are no long rollbacks. So I will also try to argue this, and sort of one way to see it is that the goal of an adversary, in order to create a rollback, is to produce 2 chains that are equally long. And the easiest way for him to do that is when these heavy blocks are distributed across just 2 chains. So in this situation, well, then the adversary kind of needs to fill out these gaps in order to actually create a rollback, as this is the only way to actually create 2 chains of equal length. But he will get sort of a small help from the small honest blocks, which is not considered heavy, which might occur that rapidly that they do not have sufficient time in between them. And then he needs to fulfill the gaps himself. So a nice thing about this is that any weight function for which there are more weight produced with heavy weight produced with sufficient time in between than small blocks and adversarial weight, that would actually guarantee us that there are no sort of long rollbacks. Okay, so now I've talked quite a bit about this heavy block, and I thought we should really have a bit closer look on how to actually define this. So here is just an arbitrary weight function, and let this graph represent the distribution of honest produced weight across these different the different hash values. So I mean, over time, this will have sort of a roughly similar shape to the weight function itself. So now one suggestion for defining what such a heavy block should be is to simply say, okay, everything that is above this threshold H, well, that's a heavy block. Everything below, that's a light block. And now, of course, we're only interested in the blocks that had sufficient time between them. So I mean, there will be a small area in this graph which we cannot use. And that's what I've grayed out here, which are heavy blocks, but that by a small probability occurs close to each other, such that they can actually not be counted as something positive happening to the protocol. Okay, so what we argued before was that this area A should be larger than area B, together with all of the weight that the adversary could produce. So I think it's kind of interesting to have a look at what happens if to these areas if the network delay increases. And what happens is that, well, then there will be a larger fraction of these heavy blocks that will be close to each other, meaning that they will not contribute to something nice happening in the protocol. On the other hand, a similar effect will happen if we move this threshold to the left, or to get a larger area that contributes positively. You sort of move this threshold to the left. But unfortunately, this means that there are more blocks created within the same time span that needs to be distant apart. And this also means that sort of a larger part of these will actually not have sufficient time in between them. So lastly, finally, a helpful observation, and that is if the network delay is actually decreasing, meaning that the network condition is getting better, well, then we can actually push this this threshold to the left and consider more blocks as contributing to something good happening in the protocol, and meaning that this area will be larger, and thereby it will be faster before we achieve the good properties that we had before. Okay, so one might now ask, now I've argued some properties about these areas and their sizes, the proportions, but what does a nice weight function look like apart from this? So, I mean, we could have a look at this weight function that I have used as an example for a while and say, is this a nice weight function? Unfortunately, it is not a nice weight function. And the way to see this is that if we have a block tree, which looks like this, I mean, we would consider this to be a fairly good situation for our block tree, as we now clearly have one chain that is significantly longer than the other, and there's only a very small branch in the tree. But having the lottery or the weight function as this thing, there is actually a non-negligible probability that the adversary gets incredibly lucky and really wins the jackpot of this lottery. And this means that he potentially could be so lucky that he actually produced a new block that ruled out all of the weight that the honest party has produced. I mean, we cannot have a nice weight function which has this much variance. So what we kind of need to do is to sort of, well, one suggestion for lowering the variance is to sort of flatten the curve after a certain threshold. So that would be my two requirements for a nice weight function. It needs to have low variance, and these areas that I talked about before, they need to have the right proportions. And I hope now that some of you may be thinking, well, I know at least one weight function that looks like this. And that's, of course, the Bitcoin weight function. Right? So the Bitcoin weight function clearly has low variance, as this is actually kept. And it also has the right properties between the areas, as there are no area B if this threshold is adjusted properly. But the problem is, as I started out my talk with, that this gives a best case performance that is proportional to the worst case performance, in the sense that before anything good happens, we will still, even though that the network are now acting very fast and we will actually have delivered blocks within seconds, we still need to wait an amount of time before that is proportional to the worst case network delay, before actually having any blocks created at all. This also means that our guarantees will first arise after an amount of time that is proportional to this worst case network delay. That's bad. So I have another suggestion, which looks like this one. And we call this a capped exponential function. So, I mean, this is just a function, and you can just think of this C as some constant, and this T, I will show you how to instantiate this. So this has the same property as before. It does have low variance. And if we instantiate this T and C correctly with respect to the worst case network delay, well, then we will also have that these areas can actually have the right proportions in between them. But now the nice thing is that this can actually also speed up when we are in the best case scenario. So just to be precise about what I mean in the best case scenario, this is sort of the scenario where you are not under attack, meaning that there are no adversary, and you actually have a network that works significantly faster than what your worst case network delay might be. And the intuition for this is that when the network delay is lowered, we can sort of define heavy blocks at a threshold that is lowered compared to this worst case threshold. To provide some intuition for this, I thought we could sort of revisit my old argument for why we do not have any long rollbacks. And that the adversary needed to produce these two equally long chains. But now that we are in the best case scenario, well, then there are no adversary. So, I mean, it's probably more realistic that it looks like this, as now the heavyweight only needs to outgrow the light weight blocks. But in fact, we have also lowered our threshold in terms of the definition of what a heavyweight block actually is. So as our network is split up, it is probably the case that these blocks, these small blocks, are also produced with sufficient enough time in between them. And this means that, I mean, it's only the very, very small blocks that we actually need to outgrow. And now you can see we don't really need to wait for the very heavy blocks to be produced, as what we considered the small blocks before, they now outgrow the very, very tiny blocks. So that's the idea, and that is why we actually achieve guarantees that are proportional to the real network delay, to the current network delay, when we are in the best case scenario, when there are no adversary. All right, so to sum up, we present a general framework capable of analyzing weight functions, and we show that there are advantages of using different weights in the lottery. And we have a paper available in ePrint. So thank you for your attention.